Hello again, and welcome back to another video build. This time around, it's all about the paint job. And for some reason, I'm only using paintbrushes. Hope you enjoy it. This video will be all about the painting process, and we'll be starting off with a fully prepared resin figurine. That means we're skipping all the usual preparations, stuff like printing, cleaning, the sanding and so on. And of course, if you're curious about how I like to prepare my 3D prints, I would simply recommend you watch my Demon Slayer video build. It'll pretty much give you everything you need to know in great details. So we'll be jumping straight into the actual paint job. The figurine has been given 2 light coats of primer. That's done with a plain rattle can. It was labeled as a white filler primer, but it came out looking pretty yellow. Luckily, it kind of looks amazing this way. I almost get the feeling of looking at a sculpture. So next, we'll be using the airbrush. No, seriously, you didn't get clickbaited. We're sticking with paintbrushes. Because I just realized just how much time I spend on masking and cleaning out the airbrush repeatedly. Now, I love my airbrushes, but they can sometimes feel a bit tedious and constricted. How do you feel about this? So I wanted to kind of switch it up a bit, and I went back to the old school paintbrushes. It just feels more tactile and spontaneous. And there's definitely a lot of exciting techniques that can be done with just some paint and a brush. We start off by locking in all the base colors. This is just a simple layer of flat acrylic paint. Usually it's just one shade of the color, but depending on which part I paint, I might even add some shadows and highlights in this step. The same approach is used on the blue hair, the purple pants, and all the different leather parts. And of course all the remaining details. As for the most important part of the figurine, the eyes, there is definitely several ways to go about this. Personally, with such a small face to work with, I like to start off by painting in the white, which of course isn't a bright white, but more of a light gray color. I like to thin out the paint just a bit more than usual. This will make it easier to reach all the small crevices with a small brush. But since the paint is thinned out so much, you might have to apply 2 to 3 coats. Another benefit of doing it this way is that if you take a slightly different path, or overlap the edges a bit, you will end up with a really smooth transition between the colors. This is a really useful technique for painting the lips. The upper lip, of course, needs those strong, clean lines. But the bottom lip, it needs to have that smooth transition into the skin color. So with a heavily thinned out paint, I apply this in several layers, slowly building up the saturation that will give you a smooth transition between the warm pink lips and the cool skin tones. The eyebrows are usually painted on with a lot of thin, short brush strokes. But in this case, I noticed the model had a slightly elevated or beveled eyebrows already. The same could be said about the eyelashes, so it was simply a matter of painting them black. By this stage, every detail on the model had been given some sort of base color to work from. So before I move on to the next part, I would usually go for some sort of satin varnish, just to seal all those colors in. There's quite a bit of gradients to choose from, but at this point, I was so focused on not using the airbrush that I ended up using a plain rattle can. Unfortunately, I only had a high glossy varnish, so now it simply looks like a plastic Barbie. Fortunately, this is just a base coat to work from. Now as we move into the second part, the first thing I really like to get in place is the eyes. I paint the irises with thin, short brush strokes, all of which are pointed inwards to the pupil. The pupils are painted black before I use a light gray color to add a single highlight. I might go for a lighter shade of blue later on and even finish it off with a glossy varnish at the end. But for now, it looks good enough to move on. If we skip a bit ahead, you can see I've been working on painting the skin. I thought I wanted to paint this figurine in an arcane style-ish type, but I felt it ended up looking more like cell shading, and I really didn't like it. So I started over again and took another approach. I picked out all the shades of the skin tones I wanted and a bottle of brush retarder. You see, mixing in some brush retarder and using a wet palette will give you the opportunity to paint with the technique that's called wet on wet. At least that's what we called it back in the 90s. And of course, I was painting it on large canvases. Usually something like 1 by 2 meters, so pretty big. But the concept should remain the same. The benefits, and the reason why I'm doing it this way, is that the acrylic paints will take a much longer time to dry. It'll act more like an oil paint. So if you paint in all the highlights, and you can go in pretty heavily, followed up by all the shadows and maybe some midtones, you'll actually have more than enough time to go back in again and really smooth out the transitions between the shades. It took a minute to get used to painting like this again, and actually how to apply this technique on such a small scale. Apparently, the paint ended up being a little too wet, so I ended up not using the wet palette. It seems I only needed the acrylic paints, mixed in with some brush retarder. With this technique, you can almost mimic an airbrush, as you're left with such a smooth result. However, I could have just used an airbrush, so I did leave some brush strokes on purpose, just to give it a bit of a roughness. It's really subtle, but I thought it fit the figurine perfectly. The face is painted more or less in the same way, only I started with the shadows this time, and I used a slightly smaller brush, just to have a bit more control. I could have shown you this in a more step-by-step way, but let me explain it this way. I believe it's a very common misconception, especially for beginners, to believe that painting a face would be more difficult than any other part of the body. But it's actually no more different than painting the shoulders, for example. This is already a three-dimensional model, so you'll only need to look for ways to enhance the shape that's already there. This is simply done by adding shadows, midtones, and highlights. The leather top was painted with just a bit of thinner to the paint. And again, I simply added some shadows and highlights, following the obvious shapes of course. On the second pass, I adjusted the paint to be a bit dry and thick. This would mean I left some brush strokes, giving it some more texture and a bit rougher look. I'm not sure if this is some kind of leather or other type of fabric, But I do believe it's important to give the different details a slightly different texture. Now there's a lot of leather parts on this figurine, and it will make it more believable if I take a slightly different approach on how I go about painting each one. So on this piece, I went back to the thinned out paint. Since I was doing everything by freehand, I didn't really see the need to apply any masking tape. Being right-handed gives me a better line of sight and much better control on my left side of the paintbrush. So when I flip the figurine again, I can better control the spacing and more easily get a smooth, crisp edge. I think maybe that instead of explaining every little part I paint equally detailed, I'll give you a more step-by-step on how I painted the leather gauntlets, and then maybe move a bit faster through the remaining parts. I start by picking out 3 shades of brown color, a shadow, a midtone, and a highlight. I might add some black and a bit of red to the shadows. And as for the highlights, I might add a bit of yellow. As for preparing the 3 shades of color, I only apply a bit of acrylic thinner, as well as some paint retarder, just to give me a bit extra working time. I started on the inside, applying some shadows, then quickly moving on to the midtones, before applying the highlights on the opposite side, just looking for a way to enhance the round shape of the gauntlet. Notice that I'm using a very small paintbrush, and the paint is applied pretty heavily, in many small brush strokes. So this will help building up a believable texture. Sometime later, when it's fully dry, it should look something like this. Now, there is a lot of color shades in there, but they don't just pop as much as I would like them to. So as a last step to really make it stand out and look more like a piece of thick leather, I usually apply some dark brown wash ink. With only one application, it really becomes more saturated, and the textures and different shades really come to life. I painted the leather piece on the other arm the same way. For the rest of the leather parts, including the boots, they are all painted with slightly different approaches, mixing up the painting techniques and using slightly different shades of the color. As for the bottom of her boots, you can clearly see I've been painting them a bit sloppy. You might be tempted to just paint them black again, getting back that clean edge. But instead, just apply one coat of some heavily watered down black paint. You'll get that clear edge again, but also all the paint I spilled over while dry brushing it will have the effect of making it look more dirty and worn out. Just a quick simple trick. As for all the remaining parts, they are all painted with some of the same techniques we've already covered. For the metallic parts, I started off with a black base coat. Then I chose to go with some acrylic copper paint. If I was to do it with an airbrush, I would have chosen to go with some of Allclad's metallic paints. But this acrylic paint is meant to be applied with a paintbrush. It's clearly a much thicker paint, and I only needed to apply one coat to get a good even coverage. This is followed up by applying a couple of washes. I like to use a very dark brown and one that is almost black. I apply it pretty heavily using a small brush. And then quickly, before it has time to dry, I go back over it again with a clean brush, taking away some of the paint I just applied. The final step is to apply some more copper paint again. I'm not dry brushing it, but it's more like I'm dabbing it on, almost creating a new layer where I control where the highlights go. Then it was time for some more straightforward, smaller details. Getting really close to the end now, I was finally ready to paint on her tattoos. In addition to plain tap water, there are quite a few mediums to choose from that lets you thin out the acrylic paint, almost to the point where it becomes transparent. Now, I had a plan until I saw the result. Clearly, this is not the way. So I obviously had to do it all over again. However, I did paint all the remaining parts first, just to be safe, in case they would leave some kind of texture or shine through in some way. At least this way, it would all be uniformed. I ended up choosing an opaque, light baby blue color, in which I also made sure to mix in some of the flesh tones. It's really subtle, but this will help it look more natural and blend in better. I was also going to add a darker blue for the remaining tattoo details. But since I had just finished putting on 2 coats of paint, I kind of cleverly, based on past failures, decided to let it dry a bit first. So I moved on to painting her blue hair. It's painted in the same way as the rest of the figurine. 3 shades of blue, some acrylic thinner, and a bit of brush retarder, just for that bit of extra working time. And then it's all a matter of putting in the shadows and highlights, while going back and forth, smoothing out the transitions between them. Going back to her tattoos again, I chose a darker shade of blue to paint in the last few details, as well as some highlights, just to make it a bit more lively. And finally, attaching and painting her bangs. I believe that's what it's called. And I have to say, that last piece, that was the thing that brought it all together for me. And while my wife is setting up the camera for the final shots, I have to say what I usually say at this point. That was the last piece of work I did on this prop.
Nothing in the world could ever be good again. I've been nothing but a girl who really should be nothing less. On my side, and that you tell us so how you actually feel. If you do, then they'll cut you right at the heel, and it hurts. No one can save you. It's all on your mind to change too. And baby, you can really try if you climb your way up. Do it on your own and you shit out of luck. Nobody will help if you find too close to the sun. 'Cause you're gonna get burned. Yeah, you're gonna get burned.
And as far as the airbrush versus the paintbrush goes, we all knew this from the beginning. A combination of the two always gives the best result. But it's a really fun exercise that maybe brings back some of the skills you thought you might have forgotten. We really hope you found this video enjoyable to watch, and hopefully, maybe, learned a new trick or two. Make sure you subscribe and hit that bell, and we'll try and share our next build with you. Thank you for watching.